This time, I brought my Echo, and my phone is charging, so it shouldn't black out again. And I have an audiobook because I do not have the spoons to read this entire book. So, Alexa is going to help. No.
Here's something I found.
Alexa, sleep. Okay. It's Powerade. If I don't have enough sodium, I tend to start fainting. Alexa. Alexa, resume audiobook, chapter 1.
Resuming State and Revolution.
By Vladimir
Alexa,
Ilyich Lenin.
play chapter 1.
The State and Revolution. The State and Revolution is generally regarded as Lenin's major work. Most of the manuscript was written in early 1917, while Lenin was in exile in Switzerland. He put it aside to return to Russia later that same year. The book was finished during the historic summer of 1917 and was published in August, only a few months before the Bolshevik Revolution. This study, in addition to its ideological significance, is perhaps the most polished of Lenin's works. It is generally less polemic in style, more carefully organized, and more free of statistics and dated details than his other writings. For these reasons, it is more difficult to summarize in a brief note. It requires and deserves a careful and thorough reading. The importance of The State and Revolution is profound, for in this work, Lenin specifically outlines the incompatibility of Leninism and Western democracy. According to Lenin, Leninists cannot participate in democracy for any purpose other than to destroy it. Parliamentary government must be swept away. The non-Leninist state must be shattered and utterly destroyed. Together with this absolute, unyielding policy, which totally rejects not only capitalism, but also all Western physical forms and institutions, Lenin combines a utopian vision of society under communism. When the Leninist revolution comes to power, Lenin predicts that the new proletarian state will consistently wither away, leaving no state at all. Chapter 1. Class, Society, and the State.
Alexa, volume 6. Volume 6.
The state and the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. What is now happening to Marx's doctrine has, in the course of history, often happened to the doctrines of other revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes struggling for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes relentlessly persecute them and treat their teachings with malicious hostility, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaign of lies and slanders. After their deaths, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to surround their names with a certain halo for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping them, while at the same time emasculating the revolutionary doctrine of its content, vulgarizing it, and blunting its revolutionary edge. At the present time, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists in the labor movement occur in this revision of Marxism. They omit, obliterate, and distort the revolutionary side of its doctrine, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is, or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxist. Don't laugh. More and more frequently, German bourgeois professors, erstwhile specialists in the extermination of Marxism, are speaking of the National German Marx, who, they aver, trained the labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of conducting a predatory war. In such circumstances, in view of the incredibly widespread nature of the distortions of Marxism, our first task is to restore the true doctrine of Marx on the state. For this purpose, it will be necessary to quote ad length from the the works of Marx and Engels. Of course, long quotations will make the text cumbersome and will not help to make it popular reading, but we cannot possibly avoid them. All, or at any rate, all the most essential passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state must necessarily be given as fully as possible in order that the reader may form an independent opinion on the totality of views of the founders of scientific socialism and on the development of those views, and in order that their distortion by the now prevailing Kautskyism may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. Let us begin with the most popular of Engels' works, Der Ursprung der Familie des Privateagentums und des Staats, the 6th edition of which was published in Stuttgart as far back as 1894. We must translate the quotations from the German originals, as the Russian translations, although very numerous, are for the most part either incomplete or very unsatisfactory. Summing up his historical analysis, Engels says, "The state is therefore by no means a power imposed on society from the outside. Just as little is it the reality of the moral idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel asserts. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is cleft into irreconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel, but in order that these antagonisms, classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves and society in sterile struggle, a power apparently standing above society became necessary for the purpose of moderating the conflict and keeping it within the bounds of order. And this power, arising out of society, placing itself above it, and increasingly alienating itself from it, is the state."
Alexa, pause. Here we have expressed in its clearness the basic ideal of Marxism on Here we have expressed in all clearness the basic ideal of Marxism on the question of the historical role and the meaning of the state. The state is a product and the manifestation of of class antagonisms. The state arises when, where, and to the exact that the class antagonisms cannot be objectively recoiled, and that consecutively, the essence of the state proves that class antagonisms are irresistible. Gotta hate pronunciation. It is precisely on this most important and fundamental point that the distortions of Marxism arise along two main lines. On one hand, the bourgeois and parliamentarily petty bourgeois ideologies compel under the pressures of historical facts to admit the state only exists where there are class antagonisms and class struggles. Correct Marx in such a way to make apparent that the state is an organ for reconciliation of the classes. According to Marx, the state could neither arise nor maintain itself if a reconciliation of the class were possible. But with the petty bourgeois and professors and publishers, the state in this frequency of strength of benevolence reforce to Marx become a canceller of classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class domination, an organ of oppression of one class by another. Its aim is to create a declaration of order, which legalizes and presents this oppression by moderating this between the classes, but in the opinion of the petty bourgeoisie politicians, order means reconciliation of the classes, not oppression of one class by another. To moderate coalitions does not mean, they say, to deprive the oppressed class of certain definitions, means, methods of struggling for the overthrowing of the oppressors, but for the practice of reconciliation. For instance, when the Revolution of 1917, the question of the real meaning of the role of the state arose in all of its vastness, as a practical question demanding the immediate action on a wide mass scale. All the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks suddenly and completely sank to the petty bourgeoisie of reconciliation of classes by the state. Immunity resorts to the articles by politicians of both these parties. All the socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, suddenly and completely sank to the petty bourgeoisie theory of reconciliation of the classes by the state. Resolutions, articles by politicians of both these parties are sanctuary through the thought with purely petty bourgeois and theory of reconciliation. The state is an organ of dominance of a defined class which cannot be reconciliated with its antipole, the class oppressed to it. The petty bourgeois democracy is never able to understand its attitude towards the state, is one of the most telling proofs that our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, which we Bolsheviks have always mentioned. But petty bourgeois Democrats with near socialist philosophies, on the other hand, not even going to try to pronounce that, distortions of Marx is far more subtle. Not going to pronounce it either. There is no denying that the state is the organ of class dominance, or class antagonisms, or God. But when forgotten or glossed over, is this: if the state is the product of irreconcilable character or class antagonisms, it is a force standing above society that is increasingly separating itself from it. Then it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible, not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the appeals of the state power, which was created by the ruling class, and in with which this separation boiled, as we shall see later. Marx drew this theoretical, self-evident conclusion. Of historical analysis of the problems of revolution, and it is exactly this conclusion which, as we shall fully in our succulent remarks, that have forgot and distorted. Alexa, resume. Alexa, resume the audiobook.
This fully expresses the basic idea.
Alexa, resume the audiobook.
This fully expresses the basic idea of Marxism on the question of the historical role and meaning of the state. The state.
Resuming state and revolution.
Necessary for the purpose of moderating the conflict and keeping it within the bounds of order. When this power, arising out of society, placing itself above it, and increasingly alienating itself from it is the state. This fully expresses the basic idea of Marxism on the question of the historical role and meaning of the state. The state is the product and the manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises when, where, and to the extent that class antagonisms cannot be objectively reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable. It is precisely on this most important and fundamental point that distortions of Marxism, proceeding along two main lines, begin. On the one hand, the bourgeois ideologists, and particularly the petty bourgeois ideologists, compelled by the pressure of indisputable historical facts, to admit the state only exists where there are class antagonisms and a class struggle, correct Marx in a way that makes it appear that the state is an organ for the conciliation of classes. According to Marx, the state could neither arise nor continue to exist if it were possible to conciliate classes. According to the petty bourgeois and Philistine professors and publicists, frequently on the strength of well-meaning references to Marx, the state conciliates classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule and an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It creates order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the collision between the classes. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, order means the conciliation of classes and not the oppression of one class by another. To moderate collisions means conciliating and not depriving the oppressed classes of definite means and methods of fighting to overthrow the oppressors. For instance, when, in the Revolution of 1917, the question of the real meaning and role of the state arose in all its magnitude as a practical question demanding immediate action on a wide mass scale, all the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks immediately and completely sank to the anti-bourgeois theory that the state conciliates classes. Innumerable resolutions and articles by politicians of both these parties are thoroughly saturated by this purely petty bourgeois and Philistine conciliation theory. Petty bourgeois democracy is never able to understand that the state is the organ of the rule of a definite class, which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, the class opposite to it. Their attitude towards the state is one of the most striking proofs that our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, which we Bolsheviks have always maintained, but petty bourgeois Democrats with near-socialist phraseology. On the other hand, the Kautskian distortion of Marxism is far more subtle. Theoretically, it is not denied that the state is the organ of class rule, or that class antagonisms are irreconcilable. But what is lost sight of, or glossed over, is this. If the state is the product of irreconcilable class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society and increasingly alienating itself from it, it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible, not only without violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power which was created by the ruling class and which is the embodiment of this alienation. As we shall see later, Marx very definitely drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion from a concrete historical analysis of the tasks of the revolution, and, as we shall show fully in our subsequent remarks, it is precisely this conclusion which Kautsky has forgotten and distorted. 2. Special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc.
Alexa, pause. I need a moment to gather my thoughts. So here's how it's going to go. You're going to read passages, and I'm going to try to break it down the best I can. Honestly, it's easier for me to read the little red book, because Chairman Mao's writings is easier for me to read. I think when we are reading this passage, since we all know why I have made this live stream, it's to try to find a way to speak to anarchists and those who are unwilling to listen to Marxist theory and continue on in their idealistic ways, which is harmful towards a revolutionary movement. You must do everything in your power to make sure that a revolution is always protected from those who wish to co-opt it for their own goals, opportunists. I'm not saying that all anarchists are bad. I'm saying that there are anarchists who use anarchy as a way to be opportunist. This has been a historical thing. This isn't something that is on left books. This is something that has happened throughout history. If you see what happened with the Free Territories, if you see what happened with Rojava, if you have seen everything, you can see how anarchists are completely unprepared to handle the stress of the dominating class trying to take back power. They do not understand this because they have been part of the petty bourgeois class. This is what white anarchists will never understand. Like Lenin stated, they will never be able to understand that the state is a maintaining of the ruling class to oppress the proletariat. They also do not understand this because they are a part of the petty bourgeois class, whether if they know it or not. Yes, they are working class, but they still benefit from colonialism and continue to benefit from the slavery of mass incarceration. They still benefit from living on stolen land without any apologies. They still control this land without any regard for its indigenous population. They continue to exploit others for their own goals, yet they think they can be part of the working class when in reality they're part of the petty bourgeois class. What marks the petty bourgeois class is their ability to become part of the bourgeoisie. This is something that we must understand. If you are white in this country, you have a better chance of becoming part of the bourgeoisie yourself. You have a microscopic chance of becoming part of the bourgeoisie, but it has always been part. You always have a chance. Jeff Bezos and all of these came from what you would call middle-class families. The middle class is a petty bourgeois class which exploits those who exploits the lower classes for its own gain. And this is where white anarchists come in. They grew up in a petty bourgeois class. They do not have the understanding of the proletariat, because they still maintain the ideal of idealism, and they do not understand what oppression does. So they will never be able to understand how one class will always try to assert itself back once it has been abolished. Alexa, resume Spotify.
Resuming Spotify.
Is the establishment of a public power, which is no longer directly identical with the population organizing itself as an army. Impossible, since the cleavage into classes. This public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but of material appendages, prisons, and coercive institutions of all kinds, of which Gentile society knew nothing. Engels further elucidates the concept of the power, which is termed the state, a power which arises from society, but which places itself above it and becomes more and more alienated from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men, which have prisons, etc., at their disposal. We are justified in speaking of special bodies of armed men because the public power, which is an attribute of every state, is not directly identical with the armed population, with its self-acting armed organization. Like all the great revolutionary thinkers, Engels tried to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers to the very fact which prevailing Philistinism regards as least worthy of attention, as the most common and sanctified, not only by long standing, but one might say by petrified prejudices. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power, but can it be otherwise? From the point of view of the vast majority of Europeans of the end of the 19th century whom Engels was addressing, and who have not lived through or closely observed a single great revolution, it cannot be otherwise. They completely fail to understand what a self-acting armed organization of the population is. To the question, whence arose the need for special bodies of armed men, standing above society and becoming alienated from it, police and a standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines...
Alexa, volume 7.
...to answer with a few phrases borrowed from Spencer or Mikulovsky, by referring to the complexity of social life, the differentiation of functions, and so forth. Such a reference seems scientific. It effectively dulls the senses of the average man and obscures the most important and basic fact, namely, the cleavage of society and irreconcilably antagonistic classes. Had this cleavage not existed, the self-acting armed organization of the population might have differed from the primitive organizations of a tribe of monkeys grasping sticks, or of primitive men, or of men united in a tribal form of society, by its complexity, its high technique, and so forth. But it would still have been possible. It is impossible now because civilized society is divided into antagonistic and, indeed, irreconcilably antagonistic classes. The self-acting army, of which would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state arises. A special force is created in the form of special bodies of armed men. And every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, demonstrates to us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving not the exploiters, but the exploited. In the above argument, Engels raises theoretically the very question which every great revolution raises practically, palpably, and on a mass scale of action, namely, the question of the relation between special bodies of armed men and the self-acting armed organization of the population. We shall see how this is concretely illustrated by the experience of the European and Russian revolutions. But let us return to Engels' exposition. He points out that sometimes, in certain parts of North America, for example, this public power is weak. He has in mind a rare exception in capitalist society. In parts of North America, in its pre-imperialist days where the free colonists predominated, but that in general it grows stronger. The public power, grows stronger, however, in proportion as the class antagonisms within the state become more acute, and with the growth in size of the population of the adjacent states. We have only to look at our present-day Europe, where class struggle and rivalry and conquest have screwed up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to devour the whole of society, and even the state itself. This was written no later than the beginning of the 90s of the last century, Engels' last preface being dated June 16, 1891. The turn towards imperialism, meaning that the complete domination of the trusts, the omnipotence of the big banks, a colonial policy on a grand scale, and so forth, was only just beginning in France, and was even weaker in North America and in Germany. Since then, rivalry and conquest has made gigantic strides, especially as, by the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, the whole world had been finally divided up among these rivals in conquest, i.e., among the great predatory powers. Since then, military and naval armaments have grown to monstrous proportions, and the predatory war of 1914 to 17 for the domination of the world by England or Germany, for the division of the spoils, has brought the devouring of all the forces of society by the rapacious state power to the verge of complete catastrophe. As early as 1891, Engels was able to point to rivalry and conquest as one of the most important distinguishing features of the foreign policy of the great powers. But in 1914 to 17, when this rivalry, many times intensified, has given birth to an imperialist war, the rascally social chauvinists cover up their defense of the predatory interests of their bourgeoisie by phrases about defense of the fatherland, defense of the republic and the revolution, etc. 3. The state as an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class.
Alexa, pause. Pause. The state as an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class, or maintaining of a special public force standing above society. Taxes and state loans are needed. Having at their disposal a public force and their right to tax, and the officials now stand as an organ of society above society. The free, voluntary retrospects, which was according to the organs of the generic forms of government, does not satisfy them, even if it could have. Special laws are enacted regarding to the sanctity of the viability of the officials. Stabbered police servants have more authority than the representative of the clan, but even the head of the military power of civilization may well envy the least among the chefs of the clan. The unconstitution and unconfessed repeat which is paid to him. Here the questions regarding the privileged position of the officials as organized of the state power is clearly stated. The main point is as it follows, which places them above society. We shall see how theoretical problems was solved and practiced by the Paris Commune of 1871, and how it was stuttered over in a reactionary manner by Kautsky in 1912. As the state arose out of the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but at the same time arose in the midst of the conflict of three cases. It is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which by virtue therefore becomes the dominant class politically, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. Not only the ancient and feudal states were organs of exploitations of slaves and serfs, but the modern representatives of the state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. By way of exploitation, however, there are periods where the working class so armed equilibrium that the state power appealing as a manner assumes for the moment of a certain independence in relation to both. Such were, for instance, absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Bonaparte of the First and Second Empires in France, and the Bismarck regime in Germany. Such, we may add, is now the Khrushchev government in the Republic Russia. After its shift to persecuting the revolutionary proletariat, at the moment when the Soviets, thanks to the leadership of the petty bourgeois Democrats, already became important, why the bourgeoisie is not yet strong enough to dispose them outright. In a democratic republic, Engels continues, Wealth wields power indirectly, but most effectively first by means of corruption of the official American, second by the meaning of the alienation of the governments which stocks exchange France in America. At the present time, imperialism and the domestication of the banks has developed to an unnatural fine art, both of these methods, defining and asserting the omnipotence of wealth and a democratic republic of all dispositions is, for an instance, the first months of the Russian Democratic Republic. One might say that during the honeymoon of the Union of Soviet Socialist Revolutionaries and Mensheviks with the bourgeoisie, Mr. Not gonna try to pronounce that, obscured every measure and coalition cabinet, resuming the capitalists and their war profiteerings and their plundering of the public treaty by means of army contrast, and after his resignation, of course, by the similar, was rewarded by the capitalists, was a soft job carrying a salary of 120,000 rubles per immune. What was this? Direct or indirect bribery? A friendly relation? What is the role to play by the Khrushchev's God damn it, Vladimir, help me. Are they directed or only the indirect of allies, millionaire treasurers, and the omnipotence of wealth? Is this such more secure in a democratic republic, since it does not depend on the poor political shell? For capitalism, therefore, one capital has gained control through. I'm not going to try because those names are hard, though I'm going to break at the fourth part of this chapter so I can get some help pronouncing these names and so I can rest for a moment. The omnipotence of wealth is more secure in a democratic republic, since it does not depend on the poor political shell of capitalism. A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism. Therefore, once capitalism has gained control of the very best shell, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no challenge, either persons or instruments of the parties in the petty bourgeoisie, can shake it. We must also note that Engels quite define regards universal sufferance by the means of the bourgeoisie dominance. Universal suffrage democracy is an index of maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything else but that in modern states. The petty bourgeois Democrats, such as our Soviet heirs, the Mensheviks, and their twin brothers, social chauvinist opportunists of West Europe, and all the more from universal suffrage, they themselves share and install into the minds of the people the wrong ideal of universal suffrage, and the modern state is really capable of expressing the will of majority of the toilets and assuring the realization. We can only note the wrong ideal, only point out that this is perfectly clear, exact statement by Engels, and is distorted at every step in propaganda, agitations, official, i.e. opportunist socialist parties, opportunist socialist party. A detailed analysis of the fakeness of this ideal, which Engels brushes aside, is a given in our further account of the views of Marx and Engels on modern states. A general summary of his views is given by Engels in the most popular of his works in the following words. Friedrich Engels: the state, therefore, has existed for all eternity. There has been societies which managed without it, which had no conception of the state and state power. At a certain stage of economic development, which was necessary for rounding up with cleavage of society into classes, the state becoming necessarily owning to this cleavage. We are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes has not only ceased to be necessary, but is beginning to become a positive hindrance to the production. They will disappear as invincibility as they arose at the earlier stages, along with the anew of the basics of free, equal associations. Production will not put the whole state's machine where it will belong, in the museum of adequate side by side with the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. It is end quote. It is not often that we find this passage quoted in propaganda and agitation literatures of contemporary social democracy, but even when we do come across it, it is generally quoted in the same manner as one boxes below the icon, i.e., it is done merely to show official respect for Engels without any attempt to gangle the breadth and depths of the revolutionary action proposed by this, the whole state machine, to the museum of adequacies. In most social calls, we do not even find an understanding of Engels calls this state machine. Part 4. The withering away of the state and violent revolution. We will be back. I will be back in 15 minutes.